C-D-E-F-G, gummy bears are chasing me. The relentless
pursuit
of whatever
works
in the life of a child.
Welcome to Fostering Futures with CAHELP, a podcast dedicated to our relentless pursuit of whatever works in the life of a child. I'm your host, Athena Cordero, inviting you to join me and countless others as we share our unique perspectives and expertise in the world of special education, behavioral health, social-emotional well-being, and community. Follow us on Buzzsprout, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
Hello, I'm Pam Bender, and I'm going to be your host today, filling in for Athena Cordero. I'm thrilled to be joined by Iván Campos, Program Specialist for CAHELP. Iván brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in helping schools and families navigate speech and language services. Together, we'll discuss eligibility, available supports, and practical strategies for parents to advocate for their child's success. Welcome, Iván.
Thank you for having me here.
Well, to start, could you tell our listeners a little bit about your role and background in speech and language services?
Absolutely. I would say that my introduction to speech and language services came through early intervention. I used to serve as an interpreter. And so there I became aware of ages 0 through 3 in terms of their needs. And that's where someone suggested to me, oh, you'd be great if you become a speech language pathologist. So I started off on that journey. And in terms of my work experience as a speech language pathologist, bilingual speech language pathologist, there's only about 8% of us in the United States. My journey has taken me through serving the public schools, also in some private practices, and along with a residential nursing facility for children with that are vent dependent and also receive intravenous feeds. And also an inpatient rehab for Loma Linda. So a little bit about kind of where I've been. In terms of what I do at the CELP, as a program specialist, I'm assigned to various school districts and support in the areas of what it could be professional development, maybe a thought partner to the special ed director, maybe facilitating IEPs, compliance work, and then also professional development in various different areas, including speech and language and AAC.
So as you talked about becoming a speech language pathologist and starting out as an interpreter, what do you think inspired you the most about moving on to being a speech language pathologist?
That's a great question. I was living in rural Virginia at the time, where small towns, maybe 2,000 or 3,000, population, and the Hispanic population, Spanish-speaking population, was maybe the 1% of the population there. And so I saw such a great need in terms of early intervention, in terms of being able to communicate with families in their native language, that it made such a dynamic, it influenced the dynamic between the speech language pathologist, the early intervention staff, and the family. And so I saw myself of, wow, imagine if I was able to continue my education and obtain this degree, what an impact I could have with families in terms of somebody speaking their language, understanding their culture, and being able to be a bridge to obtaining services. And that's kind of where the desire, I think, came from.
Okay.
To fill a need.
Right. That sounds exciting. And so when we were talking earlier, you had shared that you had an experience with a family at a park one afternoon. And I think about, as you talk about how exciting you were about bringing everybody together, even where you're at now, when you're out in the community, you're still thinking about that. Do you want to share a little bit about your experience with this family?
Definitely. I'm going to give credit to my wife because she's the social butterfly. And so we're at the dog park and, we have our little 2 chihuahuas there, and there's all these other big dogs. And, there was a little interesting interaction between a bigger dog and a little chihuahua, one of my chihuahuas. And so a conversation started with a family that was there that my wife kind of brought it forth. And so somehow my wife shared that she's a special education teacher. Oh, and my husband's a speech language pathologist. He now works at CAHELP. And so that kind of started this conversation. And I'm going to use a pseudonym for just to kind of paint a story of how this family went through a journey to get services. And so child is 3 years old, name is Sophia, and was receiving services through her insurance. Did not go the route of early intervention from 0 to 3, but started off maybe with speech and language services through medical insurance. And so they were asking, is there anything at school that could help my child? I know there's preschool programs, but those are for kids that are talking, correct? My child is still not potty trained. Will they accept her? And so it was kind of this conversation about, are there any services for our child from 3 years and above? And I said, absolutely. So then that kind of spurred a conversation about, do you know where your home school is? And the family did not know. So then I hopped on my phone. We looked up the district where they lived in, and were able to find a home school. And so kind of set them on their way. And so, but their questions were related to, how do I ask for an assessment? Who do I talk to? Do I need to enroll my child? They had so many questions about services and what they could look like. And they were asking, well, what if she has other areas of need? Do I need to tell them, or will they know, meaning the school? And that was kind of that interaction that kind of had me thinking, I wonder if there's more families that maybe are trying to figure out how to get support for their child, but may not know where to start, especially if they didn't go through Inland Regional Center or a 0 to 3 infant toddler program.
So with that, because she was getting medical services, do you see that there's an area that perhaps education needs to work with the medical staff to let them know what's available in addition to medical services?
I think there needs to be some type of understanding. Sometimes medical doctors may or may not fully understand services in the school setting because they're educationally related, or in the medical setting, they're more to improve health and daily functioning. There's the term called medical necessity. And so sometimes these two systems are operating, but they may not be talking to each other. You know, once in a while, doctors will write a prescription for a one-on-one aid or for a child to be assessed in the school setting, right?
Right.
But many times maybe they have so many patients on their caseloads. Maybe that conversation isn't had. Even from a speech language pathologist perspective, say you're in a private practice, I think maybe sometimes we kind of just focus within our silos and don't really, well, they're getting speech here. So, but the mom is not really, or the dad is not really asking for more. So, you know, this child will eventually talk. You know, I don't see that they need special. It might be a clinical medical speech language pathologist kind of having that thought process. But I think that there needs to be some interaction. I know when I worked in another district, prior to coming here to the SELPA, we would have some reaching out to different clinics because sometimes you get too many requests from a particular doctor, and to kind of maybe bring to them information about what to look for, what not to look for.
Right. And it's always interesting when you look at the medical model, because I've heard from parents before that, well, the doctor told me that they'll just grow into it. They're eventually going to talk, and they're not talking. And then I have another child, and that child starts to surpass their older sibling. And then I'm thinking, well, maybe I should have asked for more. And so I think making sure we understand that parents should ask for more if they are questioning.
Absolutely. And there is some variability in child development, where we're looking at windows of development. At certain ages, we expect a child for maybe, let's say, 24 to 36 months. Maybe they're going to be doing XYZ, right? So we are really looking at windows of development. Like, not all children start walking at 12 months. Some of them start at 10. Some of them start at 15. So there's a window within which we expect things to occur. But if they're not occurring during these windows, then it could be some cause for concern. And going to a medical doctor could support a child, you know, that is not enrolled in school or even in school, but receiving a medical-based service, which, by the way, the eligibility to receive those services is very different than at the school setting. I'm sure you're aware.
That was going to be my next question,
Okay.
What's the difference between medical eligibility and educational eligibility, IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act? For those of us who, just so that you know, it's the 50-year anniversary of that right now as well. So what does that mean?
I think within the medical setting, we're really looking at is there a medical necessity, meaning that without intervention, the client or the patient's quality of life will be impacted, their daily functioning. And so we're looking at it from a daily functioning, improving health outcomes model. And there's criteria. I always say that whoever is paying for the service determines the criteria in a way. And because within the medical model, you can either have an enrichment service, which means that there's not really a medical necessity. And many times families will pay out of pocket for those services. But then there is the insurance side of it, which the speech pathologist has to determine a medical necessity. And they do that through their clinical observations, standardized measures, various diagnostic tools. And eventually they will provide a diagnosis, a treatment plan, and then therapy services. And then insurance will either approve or deny. Now, you asked also about schools, correct?
Yes.
So now you mentioned an acronym, IDEA. And so within the school settings, we're bound to federal law and then California Ed Code that explains how they're meeting the requirements of IDEA. And so within the school environment, there are 13 areas of eligibility for various disabilities. And so in the school model, it's called speech or language impairment. And what we're really looking at whether there's an impact on learning or the classroom performance, and whether it requires special ed or related services. And speech is many times considered a related service. And so sometimes parents are like, well, Iván, my child is receiving articulation therapy in a private practice for one sound error, perhaps, or maybe two. But at school, they don't meet eligibility. How could that be?
Mm-hmm.
How could they receive services here and not at school? Well, then it goes back to the purpose and the why behind the medical model and the why behind the school-based model. And again, in the school model, they do assessments, evaluations, reports, and then they meet for an IEP meeting, individualized education program or plan. I've heard it said both different ways, depending on who you talk to. And then it's a team decision based to support that child if they're eligible.
So if they are already medically eligible, how would they use that insurance report when they want to request school-based services?
That's a great question. Many times parents don't want to bring information in, but if they choose to bring in information, the parents, as part of this evaluation process to determine whether their child meets eligibility for special education, can bring outside reports to be considered by the IEP team. Again, I mentioned earlier that the medical model looks at medical necessity and looks at it from the perspective of improving health and daily functioning, while at school, we're really looking at, does the child have a disability that is impacting their ability to access the general ed curriculum? Does it require a specialist? And essentially also, do they meet eligibility for a disability under one of those 13 areas? So I hope I've answered your question.
I think you have.
Okay.
Right. And so I kind of want to move into the fact that you're bilingual and being a bilingual speech pathologist or speech language therapist. How do you share with parents of families that are multilingual in knowing whether or not their child has a speech and language deficit? Maybe is it a language barrier or is there an impairment of some kind? How do we go about knowing whether or not that child would need therapy?
You know, that question requires us to look at many different factors. But in talking to a family, parents know their children the best. And so regardless if they're speaking Spanish at home, if they're speaking Hindi, Arabic, Tagalog, a child we expect to develop language according to milestones, right? So there's some universal markers for language development. However, when you look at different languages, there's some splitting off because some languages may have these grammar tenses, this other language may not. And so there's some differences, but we expect children to have words to communicate within their daily environments at home. Now, if it's a family that has maybe English, Spanish at the same time, maybe the grandparents are speaking one language to their adult children, and maybe the parents are speaking English amongst themselves and maybe only English to their children, then these children are multilingual and they may be receptively Spanish speakers and English speakers, but expressively only Spanish. But we are still looking for that they're going to have, based on developmental milestones, certain number of words, certain number of utterances, certain number of sounds that they're able to produce. And so you want to compare children that are bilingual with other children who are bilingual to see if there's a difference or not. And so it's not necessarily a standardized score or a test like it is for many for maybe English only students. There are some Spanish measures, but they're limited. And so we really want to look at that child's language acquisition profile to understand, in this context, should we expect English or Spanish? But again, we should, by developmental milestones, say a child is 5, we should expect sentences 5 to 6 words, regardless of whether they're bilingual or not. So parents will compare and say, and going back to Sophia,
Right.
Sophia comes from a home where they do speak English and another language. I don't remember the other language right now, but they were concerned that when they compare her to her cousins that are also bilingual, that she's only at the 1-word stage, where the cousins around that 3 or 4-year-olds, they're talking 3 or 4 word phrases. And so that kind of was a pause for concern for this family. When we compare her to other similar same age peers, is there a difference or not? And if there is, how far is it? Could it be that one child is shy? But I would say if you're talking several words decrease in spoken production, that's for concern.
So in those families where they find that there's a decrease in the language, whether it's their native language or English, how do speech language pathologists feel? Because I was going to say you, but not necessarily you. The recommendation for parents in developing that language, is there a recommendation from your associations or from your professional area about encouraging parents to speak in one specific language to assist with that language development? Or is it still a good thing to be speaking both languages?
My recommendation to parents was to continue to speak to their language, in the language to their children that they are comfortable with at home. Sometimes some well-meaning educators will state to families at an IEP meeting, if you want them to learn English, only talk to them in English. And so I think that is well-meaning. However, language is identity, language is culture. And so if you're lacking the ability to express yourself in your parents' language, you're missing out on the rich cultural history, traditions that are part of who your parents are. And so I always encourage families to speak in the languages at home that they are comfortable with, and to, if they want their child to become proficient in the native language of the parents, they have to practice it. They have to use it. Maybe my parents, for my example, they only spoke to us in Spanish at home. I'm assuming that if they had allowed us to speak English at home, I would be a receptive Spanish and not be able to express myself in Spanish. And so you have to use the language. You have to live in the culture to be able to connect it all together and to be able to participate within that language community. And so to me, it's very important that parents maintain that. And there's no such thing as a perfect bilingual. I also want to tell parents that, and anybody listening, that sometimes we think that, well, their English is not good enough, their Spanish is not good enough, and so don't talk in Spanish or don't talk in English. And so I say that there's a concept called translanguaging, which is really a neat concept in which language is not a Spanish bucket, an English bucket, but it's really one bucket, a unified system in which the languages interplay off of each other. And it's okay to not know a word in Spanish or in English as you're talking, or to mispronounce. That's the beauty of being bicultural, bilingual, where the old idea was that you had to be perfect. My mother would tell me, that's not how you say that. And then at school, the teachers would tell me, that's not how you say that in English. And I had struggled with that, to be honest with you, because I'm not good enough in one language or the other, according to the teacher, according to my parents, according to my cousins in Mexico, my aunts in Mexico, and uncles. You don't speak proper Spanish. But I think I went through my own journey of accepting that this is a new language, especially here in California, where we're so close to the border, and we have such a high number of individuals that speak Spanish that we have Spanglish.
Right.
And so I embrace it. I love it. And I encourage families to speak in the language that they feel most comfortable in.
I think that's great advice for parents, because I think parents struggle not knowing what they should do, especially if they're realizing that their child is delayed in one language or the other, or both. So when you're thinking about that, I kind of want to go back to when you were talking about Sophia and families receiving services through Inland Regional Center, which provides services for our 0 to 3 population, yet some counties will provide that as well. And so when you think about a child that's under 3 and they're getting services through Regional Center, what happens when they turn 3? What's that process? Are they then dropped from Regional Center, or do they go to the schools? What's kind of that process?
Great question. But before I kind of go into that process, I do want to share that with early intervention, it's part of IDEA. It's labeled Part C. And they're really looking at developmental support in their home natural environments. And the eligibility is a little bit different than the schools.
Okay.
Eligibility is really based on our developmental delay or diagnosed condition. And so they have determined their own percentage of what is considered a delay. And so it's really a different type of program. It's provided in the home environment. It's provided in the park or wherever the child is. And it incorporates the family as part of that model. Now, your question was when they turn 3, let me see if I got your question
Okay.
correct. If they turn 3, do services just start at the school?
Right. Do they start at the school? Does it end with Regional Center? Does it just stop? And of course, with Sophia's family, the parents didn't even know that they could go to the school.
Right. And so services officially will end on the child's 3rd birthday through Inland Regional Center or early intervention, right? Part C. And so then there is actual process that Inland Regional Center will initiate with the receiving school district. And it begins months ahead.
Right.
I used to be on an early childhood assessment team, and I would take all the Spanish-speaking phone calls. And they would, I believe 6 months before, there was a meeting in which I got a phone call from the regional service worker saying, Iván, I have the family here on the phone. We're going to have this meeting. But I believe even before that, the district is notified of this child potentially coming. I didn't receive that, but I know our district did.
Yes.
And so then I got the phone call from Inland Regional Center. And then we talk about transition planning meeting, kind of discussing what the school eligibility process and what is required to enroll in a school and how parents need to enroll in the school district, and that the evaluation is not going to just magically happen. There's a process and it takes time. And so sometimes we'd had parents that didn't enroll their child or request special education assessments. And so they were upset that when their child turned 3, they weren't receiving services. So I believe 2 months before the child turns 3, the district can initiate the assessment process. However, like I said earlier, a parent has to enroll the child into that preschool or that service assessment center. And also they have to sign an assessment plan, meaning parent is provided a paperwork that states that we suspect that there's a disability with your child. Here's the areas that we're going to assess by what type of professionals, speech, psychologist, maybe a classroom teacher, special ed teacher, but the parent has to sign.
So the schools can't do an assessment without the parent agreeing through a signature on an assessment plan.
Correct.
Okay.
And then we hold an IEP meeting to discuss the findings, and if the child is eligible, they could be eligible for early intervention Part C, but at school age or 3 and above, it's Part B of IDEA, they may not meet that eligibility, either because they've caught up or because, they've caught up in terms of the development.
Okay. So if I have a child who is 3 and they have they've been assessed by the schools and found that they still need some services, but I want them to go to my private preschool that's down the street from me. How do I get services, or do I have to go to the school's preschool programs, which a lot of them don't have? How do I get services for my child?
So, this is an interesting question, not an uncommon one. I did have some students that they were not enrolled in a district preschool program, like a gen ed preschool program. And maybe they were going to a daycare twice a week, a private preschool, in the morning, in the afternoon, or maybe all day. And so the way we treated it in my last district was I used the term community preschooler, not enrolled in a district program. And so when we have the IEP meeting, if it's only determined that they only need speech and language services, the amount of services, the goals is determined in that meeting. And so parents would bring their child to the school. They wait in the office. I would provide therapy. Sometimes I invited parents in. And then when I would drop off the child back in the office, I'd have a conversation with the parent, and the parent went their way. This is for preschoolers. I believe that was your question, correct?
Yes. Okay. And when I think about that, coming into the schools when you have a little one that was already getting, say, medical services for speech, it's a little intimidating because now I come in and now I have to sign an assessment plan. Now there's this IEP meeting with a bunch of people. I don't have an educational level at the level of these people. I don't really know what questions to ask. What kind of advice would you give a parent when they come into an IEP meeting? You said it greatly when you said parents know their child the best. But now I'm coming into this room with all of these experts, and now I'm feeling like I don't really know anything because I'm just the parent. How do you help a parent to prepare going into the IEP meeting to talk about the assessment and the possible offer of services?
I think it all begins with the first contact. I started my career off in preschool special ed, and then eventually was able to do the rest of the continuum, K through 12, right? And I really appreciated when families would reach out about their child's concerns, and I would talk to them about, kind of give them a big picture about the process. You have concerns, you've enrolled your child partially in the school so that an assessment can be done. And so I'd kind of gave them a lay of the land. I said, thank you for coming in, bringing your child. Now I can meet you and address your concerns. And then we would move toward an assessment. If there was other areas of suspected disability, I would bring in the school psychologist or refer to a center that did more of the assessments, right? But I would kind of give them an overview of the process. I would even just jot it down on a piece of paper, draw a diagram they could take home. We're here. In order for us to determine eligibility, there's all these steps that need to happen. So I think just having that dialogue and kind of front-loading parents about what is to come is really helpful. And I would say also that, you're going to hear terms at the meeting that can be difficult to understand, or maybe we're talking to the school staff is using acronyms. And I said, if at any time you have any questions, ask. Some parents don't want to ask questions, and some parents has too many questions. Also, parents can request an interpreter in their home language to be at the meeting to interpret for them. It's built into the laws for parents to have access to the information in their home language. And so sometimes families would bring a relative with them to the meeting. Maybe they bring a friend, maybe a teacher somewhere, or a speech pathologist. And so they bring others to the meeting. And I would tell families, sometimes the principal would say, are you going to get them to sign? And I would say, prior to the meeting, I would say, I want the parent to take the documentation home. I want them to take it home, read it, share it with their spouse. If the spouse was not in the meeting, talk to others to get input from their community of support before deciding whether they want to sign the IEP or not. It's kind of like buying a car or buying a house. All these papers get placed in front of you. Initial here, check here, sign here, date here. It's a lot of information. And the challenging thing is that as a parent, you're facing a diagnosis. And so sometimes parents can be in denial, or they can be in anger, or they can be trying to understand what is happening. My very Sophia, for example, her family, I think, was afraid to go to the school for maybe hearing the news of other areas of disability. And so they were in denial, I think, to the degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think for families, it can be very emotional to be at a meeting, and maybe it could be too long of a meeting.
It's overwhelming.
Overwhelming, I guess is the word.
Yes, I think it's really overwhelming. And coming from a person who special ed is all I've ever done, the amount of special ed ease, we talk about that all the time. In special ed, we're always talking about acronyms, and it doesn't make sense to people who are outside of special ed. Even educators don't always understand it. But I've been in an IEP meeting with my stepson, who was a student with a speech impediment. And I remember sitting in there the first time with his mom and going, okay, I'm not even understanding the report. This is something I do all the time. And I'm an expert in special education, and I'm having a hard time because of the emotions that are connected with it. And so that helped me to understand parents coming in who have no background, and then I'm asking them to sign this IEP. I love the fact that you allow parents to take it home, read it, and understand it, and then ask questions about it, because we don't always allow that. We think they have to come in and sign right away. But the other thing I wanted to just mention, when you talked about parents bringing other people with them to an IEP, which I think is awesome, but it's also the district's responsibility for bringing in the interpreter. The parent is not the responsible.
Thank you for saying that.
Yes, because they're not responsible for bringing someone to translate. The district is responsible for that, correct?
100%. When I worked in another district, we had a population of students from Guatemala that spoke a language named Canjoval. And many of these families only spoke Canjoval, and then depending on where they landed in the U.S., either they will learn Spanish, say if they were in a Latino neighborhood, maybe they're embracing Spanish, or if they're not, then maybe it'll be Canjoval in English. And so and other times these children were speaking Canjoval, English, and Spanish. And so I recall a meeting, and I'm getting a little emotional here, where those of you that know me know that I have emotions as a male. But I would say that the family was from Guatemala, and they spoke Canjoval, but yet they spoke enough Spanish to enroll their child and maybe have basic conversation with the school staff. So we're sitting in this IEP, and it was for a child in a special day class and a mild moderate class, and we had a Spanish interpreter there. And at that time, I did not know enough about these families. Eventually this kind of caused me to learn more. And so we finished the meeting, and then the parent raised their hand, and this is the only statement they said in the whole meeting. The father did. When will we get a trumpet for my son? And I thought to myself, wait, what's going on here? And then I looked at the principal, and I wondered to myself, there's another language that is being spoken by this family, and I don't think Spanish is their language that they are very proficient in. That was a conversation I had with the principal after, and the case carer. But basically, and then the parent asked another question: does every child get this meeting? But the Spanish was not what I would call conversational Spanish. And so I just left kind of aghast, like, wait, did this parent comprehend the contents of this meeting? And so that was kind of prompted me to really understand who are our students. And we have a duty as educators to advocate for our families. And so I did ask that, I'm wondering if at the next meeting we can have an interpreter that speaks Canjoval. because I'm not sure this family understood the purpose of our meeting.
Right.
And so the district did eventually contract out, and we would have a CAHELP interpreter. And I had actually was very privileged to also work with the CAHELP interpreter for my speech and language assessments. Sometimes I was doing trilingual assessments, English, Spanish, and CAHELP. And as you mentioned earlier, that when children are learning a new language, they sometimes start to lose another language. But imagine children with 3 languages.
Right.
And imagine now having to analyze that data and determine whether there's a language disorder or an impairment or a language difference. As they're learning one language, they're losing others. And so how do you determine, because there is no test,
Right.
standardized measures that encompass trilingualism. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Right. It's difficult, and it's very difficult, I think, for our parents who are multilingual, and our kiddos as we're trying to work with them.
I do have a tip for school professionals. I know there's various opinions of this. And so my perspective is that we want to make our IEP meetings comfortable, meaning that we're not talking down to parents, but we're having a conversation. And so over the years, I developed a different strategy of presenting my evaluation reports, which was I provided a copy to the parent, and I would say, I'm going to be providing a summary today at this meeting of this 20-page report. Here's my card. You can contact me at any time. Stop me at any time during this meeting if you have any questions. And I would basically start off with, here's what the referral concerns were. Here's where your child is currently at. Here's how I gathered information. I did a parent interview, teacher interview, interviewed the student if appropriate, based on their age level, right, and abilities. I did classroom observations, non-classroom observations, reviewed school records, and then I worked with the student and I administered these assessments. That took me, 30 seconds?
Right.
And then I would say, out of those 4 areas that I was looking at articulation, voice, fluency, whether there's a language disorder in expressive or receptive or social language. Mom, dad, out of those 4 areas, I saw concerns only in 1. And those are speech sounds. Your child, correct, is having difficulty with their production of speech. That is causing them not to be understood. It's frustrating them. It's impacting their ability to engage in the school environment. And so they do meet eligibility. And we're going to now talk about a plan to support your child at school.
Very good.
I never opened my report. I
think
never
that's great.
referred to the test scores. I just kept it simple because I also have a child with special needs, and it can be very emotional to sit in that meeting and to hear that your child can't do something.
Right.
And scores don't tell the story of who a child is.
It doesn't. And parents don't understand the scores.
And
It doesn't make sense.
And I embrace that model. I know that maybe some attorneys listening or some professionals would be like, but I did all this work in this report. But as a family, they want to know if their child is okay or not. And if they're not, how do we support them?
Yeah. What are we going to do?
Well-
So with that, we can talk about what we would be doing in the classroom or at school, what the services are. What are some tips you would give to parents at home for what they can do to help improve their, whether it's articulation or language? What are some ideas you would give parents to work on at home?
I would say that talk to your children. Have conversations with them. Read with them. If you're not able to read, then play a video with a narration or something that is a book maybe read aloud. Pretend play. Sing songs. Talk about your day. Ask open-ended questions. These don't require any toys, any gadgets, any apps. I would say that technology has it's a double-edged sword today in today's society, where sometimes children are interacting more with a device than with the parent.
Right.
When families, preschool age families would say, I want my child to be evaluated at the school level, 3 to 5 years old, not in a school program. When the parent would come in and said, I want an evaluation, I would ask the family, bring your child's toys that you play with your child with. I want to see how you guys interact. And I had a parent once tell me, Mr. Campos, this was the dad of this child, my child has never interacted with toys. It's always been an iPad. And so she's coming home from, or coming when child was in kindergarten now. When she's coming home from school, she's talking about some toy that you had that she's never played with before. And now she's asking me for it because all she's ever interacted was an iPad.
Isn't that interesting? And I think sometimes parents think that, well, there's so much language going on because they're playing games or they're watching videos or doing this. But it's one thing to watch language. It's not interactive, right? So they're not really working on their language because they're not interacting with anybody.
They're not. And to meet parents halfway, and I'm not sure if this is scientifically validated or not, or research-based, but I would say for every minute you're spending on a device with the child, or a child is spending on a device, you need to spend a minute talking to your child. So if it's 2 hours, then be prepared to talk 2 hours with your child. I said, do you have 4 hours? And I said, and I understand that it's easy to hand a child a device to perhaps calm them down or entertain them. But like you said earlier, if we don't use language, we lose it. And language is so situational. It's related to context, related to situations, related to culture, related to opportunities, right? And so I agree that less screen time, more live interaction, live conversations. Maybe make a technology-free kitchen table. Maybe make a technology-free family time where all phones, all devices are here. Now, children will protest.
Right.
And so many times in restaurants, you'll see a child who the iPad was taken away and it's a scene. Well, you're going to experience a scene until the child now connects with you as the parent and sees you as a real live parent that can provide needs, because the device can fulfill a need, but not in the environment itself.
Right. So there's so many things that we can do as parents that we sometimes forget. And sometimes we as parents, we're on technology too much. And so our kids are modeling what we're doing. So I think we have to kind of look at that aspect too.
But it's interesting because my teenager at home, he's a freshman in high school. He's so aware of the impact of technology on his peers. And he's like, Dad, I don't want the apps. Dad, I don't want this. I don't want technology to become me.
That's great.
And he'll even reference AI, like, I want to do it myself. I don't want a robot doing it in the background. I want it to be my voice, my work.
Very good.
Which I'm wondering if there's a pushback from younger generations. They've seen the adults, us, sometimes be buried in our phones as our children are talking to us. Maybe they've seen that as that's not what we want life to be, and so they're pushing against it.
Right. It's going to be interesting watching as the generations come up. Exactly. So you've talked a lot about interactions and what we can do. So what would you think are the 3 top things that you would tell a parent who's just starting this journey?
I would say to the parent, realize that this is a process and that the evaluation process is not like at a medical setting where you get a referral, you get sent to the specialist, and boom, you have a diagnosis, you have services. In the school, we have 60 days to evaluate once a parent signs the assessment plan. So give time for the professionals at school to do their portion. Number 2, parents, I would encourage them to be active participants in a meeting. Also, as you mentioned, request an interpreter that the school needs to provide by law. That's still number 2. And then number 3, parents also have procedural rights as a parent of a child with a disability, meaning that if they don't agree with something, they can exercise rights, meaning they can request for an independent educational evaluation. They can perhaps call their SELPA to speak to a program specialist, speak to the director, speak to a manager about their concerns. The SELPAs are there to support families as well. Maybe if there's another disagreement, maybe it needs to be elevated to a different level. But I would say ask questions, stay curious. You know your child the best, and the professionals at school have your child for a little bit of a time. And so sometimes parent input is so important in a meeting, but I understand that some parents may feel from particular cultures that the school is always right. And so there's a power dynamic. And I think as practitioners, we also need to be aware that sometimes the playing field is not level. So those are the top three, I think I would say.
I think that's great because it helps parents to give them some empowerment, right? We forget that. Any final thoughts or messages on the encouragement for parents navigating speech services?
I would say, and this is something I learned in my graduate school training, I took a class on counseling. And you may be wondering, why is a program have a class on counseling for speech pathology, right? Well, it's because they wanted us to understand what the client, the family, the student may be
I
experiencing.
think that's great.
And I would say it was, and I'm getting goosebumps here talking about it. It was, I think, the most beneficial class in my program. It was taught by a licensed clinical social worker, and they talked about something called the Kluver-Ross grief cycle, in which there's 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Myself, as a parent with a child with special needs, I've gone through that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I get stuck on one.
Absolutely. And it's not even going through each of those things in order.
Yeah.
It jumps around all over.
And I think denial is the hardest one to overcome, because as a parent, it's hard to accept that your child is not perfect or not the way that you hope for them to be. And so sometimes we delay seeking support, delay seeking services because we as a parent are not ready to accept.
Right.
And I would say that, to me, that's the most important portion. And for service providers is knowing to identify. And again, we're not social workers, we're not mental health clinicians, but learning to understand where a family may be along that cycle in order to support them and encourage them and not close the book on them because they're in denial or they're angry. And sometimes I've told some families that I've had to work with here at the SELPA that, I'm wondering if you're stuck right now and I'll bring up the stages. Where do you see yourself at?
Nice.
And help them understand. And I said, how do you think this is affecting your participation in this meeting?
That's
At the
a great
IP
idea.
table?
Mm-hmm.
And then have them identify, have them talk about it. And then I'll say, how could maybe, if you were able to resolve through this, it won't maybe delay our meetings or maybe make them much longer than they need to be, but we're able to now support your child. So sometimes the advice is for parents also to seek counseling themselves to help their child, because it's I remember when my child was given the label of a disability, and I went through this, but you project their life and you're thinking they're not going to achieve their dreams. But I would say to this parent, embrace your child, love your child, and accept and provide them all the supports to the various professionals that we have access to in this country to be able to help your child.
I think that's great. I love the fact that you not are only talking about the grieving stages for parents, but also for the speech pathologist to understand that and being able to acknowledge that within what's happening with the parent, because that's how they're going to interact with the family. And I think it's important for them to be aware of that as well. So I love the fact that your program had that counseling program. So just to wrap up, it's been a great opportunity to talk with you about speech and language pathology and speech services for our students who are multilingual, the IEP process, the assessment process. But here at CAHELP, we have a mission statement that is, we're here for the relentless pursuit of whatever works in the life of a child. And what does that mean to you in who you are as a person, who you are as a speech pathologist, and who you are as a program specialist with our organization?
Wow, Pam, you asked a very, very thought-provoking question here. And so I think that one of the reasons I commute to this job and work, as well as many others, is because this organization allows us to really live out that mission and be able to support school districts, families with thinking outside the box to ensure that a child is receiving what they need based on the IDEA, based on special ed. And so I think it's a privilege to be able to support families and school districts throughout that process, right? And to really not just be a mission that just lives out there on a piece of paper, but to me, it fills my bucket. And one thing that when I was a small child, I must have been maybe 7 or 8 years old, we would visit my grandparents in Mexico twice a year, Christmas and summer, and we would be there for a while. And so my parents lived in a very rural part of Zacatecas, 3.5 hours north of Guadalajara through a very mountainous, curvy road. And we would take the journey on a third-class bus.
Oh, wow.
Yes, third-class bus. And so you're like, where are you going with this, Iván? Don't worry, I do have an endpoint. Anyways, on this bus, it would stop off and, you get nauseous from all the curves and bumpy roads and, asphalt and no asphalt on the road and whatnot. But a family came on the bus that was carrying, like what I saw a teenager, and sat him down right behind us. And somehow I kept looking back. It was a child with a disability that was not able to walk. There was no wheelchair or anything. And so I kept peering through the seats. And I saw that the child was crying and the window was open. And I said, Dad, that kid is crying and his mom is not doing anything about it. And so my dad got up and said, Ma'am, your child is crying. And she goes, he doesn't talk. He cannot walk. And in Mexico at that time, there was really no services for special ed.
Right.
And so, and even now they're still developing, right? They're better in many places, right? And so then the lady told my dad, he doesn't talk. We don't know why he's crying. And then my dad said, is he hungry? The lady said, we haven't eaten in 2 days.
Oh, wow.
So my dad took my orange, peeled it, that was in my hand, and gave it to this child. And so I saw that the relentless pursuit of whatever makes, and I can't remember because I'm choking up the rest of the mission here, but I saw how my dad did that for that child. And again, I think that was my first exposure as a child that was 7 or 8 years old to disabilities.
Right.
Because back then in schools, they were not integrated.
They were kept separate or weren't even allowed to come
and so that
to school.
Story stays in the back of my mind of we have to do what's right for children.
And I think you live your mission. So thank you very much for coming and talking to us today. I really enjoyed our time together, and thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up, we want to remind you that if you or someone you know is facing a crisis, help is available. You are not alone. If it's an emergency, please call 911. For immediate support, you can reach out to the Crisis and Suicide Hotline by dialing 988. Remember, taking the first step to ask for help is a sign of strength. Stay safe, take care of yourself, and take care of each other. Until next time, be well.
In this episode, we highlight child welfare and attendance and why it matters more than you think. We explore how schools work behind the scenes to support attendance, maintain stability, and navigate school placement changes. Tune in for an eye-opening discussion about stability, access, and why showing up truly matters.
See you next time.